We have a great audience today, and I never take it lightly that people accommodate their schedules to join us on Friday for Intentional Conversations. So this is an hour that's going to be packed with, yet again, I know it, just really rich, meaningful conversations. And so I want to go ahead and get us started. My name is Dr. Nika White. I serve as the Principal Lead Consultant for Nico White Consulting. And we are a management consulting firm based in Greenville, South Carolina. And we serve clients all over the country, different industries, different sizes, private, public sector, helping them to integrate into their business framework, strategic diversity, intentional inclusion, and a lens of equity. And so you are joined us today for Intentional Conversations. Again, as I mentioned before, this is a virtual community VodCast. And I'm going to take you through just a little bit of information before we get started. I am being supported today, by the way, by three of my teammates, Elvia Pacheco Flores, one of our DEI managers with NWC, Natasha Poritzkova, another DEI manager with NWC, and then my chief of staff, Anna Viola Goodman. So I always like to really provide my level of appreciation for their support and help with our intentional conversations. And so, Natasha, take us to the next slide, please. And so we're here every Friday from 11 to 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. And I always like to make sure that I give you information about who's upcoming as in terms of our guest co-host. And so next week on November 13th, we're going to be joined by Dr. Tracy Benson. And Dr. Tracy is going to be talking about racism, anti-racism, racial bias, but specifically as it relates to schools. And so I like the fact that we're going to be able to target these conversations to schools because I don't think we spend enough time on how bias is also showing up within the schools, within the students, and how they interact. And so I look forward to that conversation. Next slide, please. And then the week after that, my friend Letitia Bird, many of you may know Letitia, but we're going to be talking about women and people of color and helping them to transform their dreams into careers while making their workplaces equitable. And of course, a place where there's a high level of psychological safety for people to bring their whole selves to that environment. So I look forward to Letitia Bird joining me on November 20th for our Intentional Conversations podcast. And then this brings me to the highlight of the day, which I get an opportunity to introduce to you all, this community of intentional conversation attendees, our guest co-host for today, which is Kayla Lee. I want to give her a proper introduction as I normally do, but then I'm going to have her just to come and greet this audience in her own way. I also want to acknowledge the live Facebook audience that we have joining us here today as well. So make sure that if you have comments that you put them into the chat area of Facebook, and we will make sure that your thoughts and your voice is being brought into the conversation here. Okay, so Kayla Lee. Kayla M. Lee is a Harvard and Hard Knock executive life coach, business strategist, and culture interpreter working at the intersection of organizational and cultural transformation, learning and development, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. She helps C-suite leaders creatively solve challenges through the lens of learning as a lifelong pursuit by designing professional development journeys that require honesty and vulnerability about oneself, one's team, and one's organization. During the journey, leaders and their teams are guided, coached, and empathetically called to accountability to form a new version of leadership, culture, and community for their organizations. And so just that alone should hopefully cause you to just be incredibly excited about what's to come. Because when you think about all of these words and all of these things that Kayla is attached to and her expertise and skill sets, I know that we're going to be in for a treat. And so I've given the formal bio. I always like now for the guests to come on and just share what do we not know about Kayla that we cannot find in her bio. So what is your story? What else can you share with us to help us get to know you, Kayla? Meet the audience.
Yeah, well, hello, I'm Kayla Lee, and one of the things that is not on my bio is actually the fact that my mother used to own a event planning business called The Dream Merchant, and I think that's what's so interesting about like LinkedIn or resumes. A lot of times it does not capture the full story, and so that's something for I guess employers to keep in mind that there are stories that are much deeper that inform the way that people are. And so her business was basically creating weddings for people that didn't have a lot of resources, and whatever resources they had, making it extremely beautiful. So kind of like making someone's dream come true of that day. So it was a really fun way to grow up and to see people being inspired. It was kind of like miracles. It's like, you did that with that amount, you know? And so kind of this instilled that my mom always said, like, the poorer you are, the more creative you have to be. And so I just think this idea of really understanding the power of resourcefulness has really definitely impacted me.
No, I love that. I love that. And what a gift. And I'm sure that it was so impressionable that it's found its way into the work that you do today, because there's such great alignment. And so,
Yes.
so let's jump into that. But before we do, I have to ask this question because I feel as though we're at a time and place to where this question deserves a moment of pause and really wanting to get the answer and to hear the answer and be responsible with that answer. But how are you doing today? How are you feeling today in consideration of the times that we're in and the high level of stress and anxiety and so many other myriad of feelings that are valid? How are you feeling, Kayla? How are you doing?
I think today I'm actually feeling well. And I think it's because yesterday I took time to listen to my body and like just to acknowledge that there's a lot going on right now. And so you're feeling pressure. And so I did something that's kind of unique for me, is that I took a nap, you know, or let's just say I tried to. And so today I'm feeling good. I think, you know, what's definitely in the background is the election. And what I believe is, like, no matter who's sitting in office, the things that I'm tackling will still be there. The struggles will still be there. And so that's one of the things that I'm just sitting with, like my destination and my purpose doesn't change who's sitting in office.
No, I love that. And I think that's so important for each of us to hear as we await the final official answer. Someone said that Twitter has already declared the results, but that's Twitter results. We're waiting on the official results. And you're right, obviously it's so top of mind for all of us. And we're hearing a lot about the significance of self-care. And so one of the things I want to do right now is I'm going to ask my colleague, Natasha, to pull up a poll, because we want to know how you, our audience participant members, are feeling right now, and how in which you are taking responsibility for self-care, because that is so critical. And we're going to talk in depth about it during this hour. And I know this is an area also, Kayla, that you're really passionate about, is helping people to realize what they need to do so that their cup can be filled to help support someone else. But you can't do that if you're pouring from an empty cup. So
bingo.
Yes. So I love the fact that the timeliness of this conversation of self-care. And I wanted to ask you how you were doing as Natasha gets that poll up, because I understand that your line of work, you hold space for people all the time. And as a practitioner that knows what that's like, sometimes we can not be as careful to put the oxygen mask on first, because we're always holding space for others and really making sure that they're okay. And so I appreciate you giving us a moment to just make sure that Kayla's okay. So, okay, so it says head over to the polls tab to let us know how your self-care is. So at the top, you'll see that we have chat, polls, and I want you to click on that polls tab. And it says on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your self-care? So let us know, 1 to 5. And what we didn't do is really indicate whether or not 1 was our top peak or 5 was. And so let's just assume that, of course, the larger the number, that is the number that you're saying, I'm feeling pretty good about my self-care. I'm really exercising a lot of intentionality around it. If you're midway, it would be about a 3. And if you feel like I am not at all considering self-care, then be honest about that. We want to see where we're falling. So let's take a minute for each of you to respond to the poll. And as you're responding to the poll, I also want to remind this audience that in Hopin, there are multiple places in which the chats can take place. We want to make sure that everyone is chatting in stage. So if you've been chatting in event, please make sure that going forward, you chat into stage so that we all can make sure that our voices are centered in the same place. And we appreciate that. And so we'll come back to you in just a second, Natasha, to see how what the poll results are. But I want to lead in with you sharing a little bit more, Kayla, about this work that you do. So first and foremost, I love the fact that you part of your title is culture interpreter. So can you just unpack that for us? What does that mean exactly?
A cultural interpreter, sorry. So for me, a cultural interpreter is really someone that sits with an organization and really understands their culture and what's going on. And so for me, when I go in and I work with someone or an organization, is really understanding how cultural is taking place. Because a lot of times, like, people will have you come in and say, this is the problem, but it's not that problem at all. So for me, that cultural interpretation is really understanding what your culture is like at your organization and how it impacts those around you in ways of improving it. So, and then too, another part of that is what's really important to me are the arts. So the arts, the role that arts play in people's lives and creativity. So that type of cultural piece, so the internal and the external cultural piece. So.
I have to remember to unmute myself. I think that's where maybe the feedback was coming from. So how do your clients know, okay, I have a culture issue and I need a culture interpreter to come in and help us to navigate, strengthening our culture? What are some of the signs for organizations to know to call on Kayla Lee or anyone else, any other practitioners that may be in that space?
I think number one, it's a desire within your organization. Number one is the desire. Secondly, is that you have dedicated time, space, resources in the form of people and finances to say, hey, this is important to me. I want to invest in it. And so one of the things that's really important, like people, I get pulled into different projects, but specifically diversity, equity, and inclusion projects. And I tell people, it's like, I am a business consultant. And the reason why I try to let people know that is many times people think of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as an extracurricular activity. It's this thing that we do on the side. It is not. It is the work. So the same way that, you're bringing in consulting agencies, I'm here to improve your business. And so it's not this side thing that we do. And so to answer your question, it's really this allocation of time, financial resources, and really a longevity, because you're not going to, whatever you're dealing with, you're not going to solve it overnight. So it has to really be a multi-year commitment to say, I'm standing my ground here. We're going to invest here, and it's going to be over the long haul. So
I completely agree. It has to be fully integrated into all areas of operations. It's not, and sometimes people will even relegate it as just an HR thing, but it's about every aspect of the organization. So I love that you amplified that. So I want to get back to now our poll question to see if our results are up. Let's see. I'm clicking on poll. Okay, I'm still seeing the poll here. How do we see the results? Okay, maybe we're still working on that, because I'm still seeing where it's asking for the poll and not for the results. But this is a key question, so we're going to try to figure that out and come back to it. But so let's talk about self-care. What are some of the best practices that, Kayla, you often encourage people to put into their normal routine to make sure that they are being very cognizant of how in which they're showing up, how they're feeling? What are some of those best practices?
For me, really what I do is I integrate self-care into people's lives. So usually when clients are working with me, the topic is actually not self-care. Like, they work with me either to launch their business, to do things that they haven't done before, and I incorporate self-care as a part of it. So for me, self-care isn't something that sits aside. It's something that's actually incorporated into your life. And so for me, self-care has meant like listening to my body, really developing the ability to say no. I'm a very empathetic person. And so for a very long time, when I should have been saying no, I was saying yes. And it really created times of me not doing what I needed to do for me. And so I think, one of the things I talk about, like, is this is very personal and like hard knocks. Like, what happens when you don't say no, when you don't have those proper boundaries, And so for me, it's really developing strategies within my own life, whether it means, hey, right now you're at a time in your life where you need to seek counseling, or you're at a time in your life where you're going to have to drink water. You're going to have to get sleep. You're going to have to eat right. You're going to have to go to the gym. And so I think that self-care is not a mystery for most of us. It's just like, how do we incorporate it in our life in a very practical way? And that's usually what I do when I'm working with my clients.
No, I appreciate that. And I'm seeing certainly a lot of organizations are becoming much more thoughtful about their EAP programs, making sure that they are accessible to their employees. So for those who really want to talk to therapists, they have that outlet. And so I think that that's been a trend, and a lot of it has to do with, again, just the reality of all that we're dealing with in today's climate. I mean, not only the looming effects of this global pandemic, but, this is, of course, a very strong, intense election year. Think about all of the situations that have surfaced across the country relevant to social unrest that is really bringing to the fore systemic racism. And so people are dealing with a lot. And so self-care is critical. So it looks like the poll results, they are up now. My teammates told me, well, Nika, you have to vote. That's why you're not seeing it. So I appreciate my teammates. But yeah, so it looks like we have most people that are in the middle. 49% are on level 3. We have 27% 4, 3% 5. We have 3% that's at a 1 and 19% that's at a 2. So, I mean, I know this is just a small sample, but what does this tell you? What does this tell you, Kayla? What comes to mind for you as you hear and see these results?
It sounds like some people are, since I don't see them, I wonder that it sounds like some people say, hey, my self-care is kind of in the middle, because you said we did at 3, right?
That's majority, 49% are right in the middle. They're number 3.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think I would, before I actually said what I particularly think, I'd love to hear if people would want to drop it in the chat. What are people actually doing? Because what people define as self-care, because we hear self-care a lot, but what does that actually mean to people? Like, what are their self-care strategies? So I talked about some of mine, but I'd love to hear what other people are doing to take care of themselves, and maybe it will actually help other people.
No, I like that idea. So please drop into the stage area of chat. What are you doing for self-care? Kayla, again, she mentioned several of her best practices. We want to hear what you're doing. And as they're putting into the chat the answer to that question, how do you define self-care, though, Kayla? Is there a more appropriate universal definition that we all should be kind of gravitating to? Or is it really kind of a personal thing?
I honestly believe that self-care is, for me personally, it's a very personal thing. Okay. And what I mean by that, like, it's going to look different. Just to understand how I'm uniquely made up. Like, for instance, like, one thing that kind of brings solace to me is actually being in a really quiet atmosphere. For some people, they don't enjoy that. And so when I'm trying to kind of go deep in thought, I need quiet. So I'm going to seek out things that are kind of that bring quiet to me. For some people, like going into nature, they're like, no, I don't want to be in the forest. I want to be on a beach. Or so I think it's a personal journey. I think it's universal and that we all need to be practicing it, but how it shows up in your life is going to be really diverse. And actually understanding that for other people as well.
So here's what's coming up. I'll read some of them off. Reading positive messages. Yeah. Exercise. Removing Twitter from the phone and using Headspace app for daily meditation. I know we're going to talk about that. Taking a day off and spending it in nature. Falling asleep to spa music radio. 10-minute walk breaks during the workday. Taking time out includes walking and listening to music, trying to eat right, removing email and LinkedIn notifications from my phone, taking a walk in the park, chatting with family and friends about pointless stuff, and really good gym session with music to get the tension out. Monthly massage, daily word, use my air diffuser, walking around the neighborhood, doing good things for others, spending time with my family, including my cat. So the list goes on and on, devotions, meditation, prayer. But I love the fact that you amplified, we each have to be reflective to be able to define and clearly understand what does that look like for us. And so, and I know I'm probing a lot, but I think this is such an important topic. And before we really delve into some of the other questions I want to get to, sometimes people are sitting back and they're saying, well, I hear you, it's a personal thing, but how do I figure out what that is for me? So what would be the steps for people to realize this is what's going to help me in my self-care? Is it trying things?
Well, you know what? I actually have another question. So I see people that are talking about things that they do that are working. I want to hear from people in the chat. What is actually getting in the way of your self-care? So we had like a number in the middle. So that means there's some people that say, hey, you know, I'm pretty good in this area, but for the ones that are kind of struggling, what is actually getting in their way? And that's one of the reasons why I said like it's unique, because we all have our own personal challenges. And so I think it's really identifying what is getting in the way of you exercising self-care.
I love that. So continue to place into the chat, but I do want to amplify what Jokina Stone, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. But this goes back to what you said, Kayla. She says telling people no is a part of self-care. And so, and I wanted to amplify that because your question was for those who recognize that you're not at that 4 or 5, and maybe you're 2 or 1, or maybe even in the middle and you struggle, you really want to increase that. You have to know what's hindering that. And so I'm reading between the lines here, and sometimes not being able to say no is hindering our self-care, of course, because we're overextending ourselves. And I know that you have some thoughts about that because we chatted about it before we actually went live today. So do you want to touch on that, why the audience members are still putting items into the chat for us?
Yeah. And so what I'm seeing that's coming up for people is like there's guilt, which we talked about earlier, the ability not to say no. Also this idea of separating your home from your work, especially when you're working with home. So that's a lack of transitioning in your day and transitioning, like understanding where these boundaries are. And so, and I've been seeing like a lot of people talk about like having too much care for other people. So I was in a meeting not too long ago, and I heard someone say, well, I have too much compassion. I have too much empathy. And that's the reason why I don't have self-care. And I was like, no, your problem is that you don't have enough compassion and empathy for yourself. And so part of this process is, and this is to me, the purpose of our topic is like, can you show up for others the way that you show up for yourself? The same way that you're an advocate, the same way that you're like, this has to be done. When we say community, you are included in that. And sometimes that means you doing something that in your mind, it might seem selfish, right? To say, no, actually, this is a boundary. This is my time. This is what I'm going to use for that. And so it's really understanding those emotions, those things that are getting in your way. And as I said, this is not something that happens like this. I think part of it is just this recognition of what's going on in your life.
I love this. Someone put into the chat, not being able to, again, that separation of work and home. And to your point, Kayla, right now that's becoming even more difficult because people are working from home. And so the blending is just, it's causing blurred lines across the board. And I think that that's also exasperating the issue and the challenge. And then guilt. I want to dig in a little bit deeper to guilt because I think that especially with all that's going on right now, it's easy for some people to see incidents and to be exposed to information, and they will start harboring guilt and not even realizing it, that that's a source of the lack of self-care. So talk about that in a sense from your point of view as to how people need to be much more cognizant of how those thoughts and feelings of feeling guilted, judged, blamed, shamed can be to the detriment of our self-care.
So like I said, number one is to recognize what you're feeling. So when I've been in situations where I should have said no, there was usually a time where emotions started bubbling up for me. Like I started feeling uncomfortable. And what happened is that I shut that down because it was more important for me to please someone else or to meet somebody else's demands or to meet somebody else's wishes for me than my own. So going back to the guilt, like I think part of it is recognizing where it's showing up in your life, how it's showing up in your life, and to say, hey, is this guilt actually coming from a place? Should I actually be feeling guilty about this? Should I feel guilty about taking a day off? And if I am, where's that guilt coming from? And that's one of the things, like, that's why I actually suggest either working with a coach or working with a counselor. Like, if you see that guilt is showing up in your life and you want to move beyond that, then that's a great time to work with a coach. If you've been seeing this long pattern of guilt and it's like, it's keeping you from doing what you need to do, like overall in life, I say go and work with a counselor. And so, and that's what I meant, like this emotional piece, your body is actually, if you're just feeling like this. And so there's so many things that our body and the way that we're made is telling us, but we ignore it because, oh, I need to be productive. We stay so busy, we can't even think. And so, and like I said, like, I can't say just like that. It's something that you have to work on. It just is. It's not going to go away like that.
Yeah. So I want to stand in solidarity with Diane, who has placed something in our chat that I think is so real and authentic. I just want to amplify it. She said, the term self-care makes me feel guilty. Mm-hmm. So even just the idea of taking time for ourselves, it causes people to feel like, am I being selfish now? Am I not being a team player? Am I not being there for others? And that in and of itself, it goes back to what we talked about, which is just guilt. But I want to stand in solidarity with Diane because since she's getting some love and support from others in the chat, because that is such a real statement. And to be in that vulnerable place to where just the idea alone of trying to put self first and prioritize self is a challenge for a lot of people. You mentioned early on when I asked, how are you doing and how do you take care of self? And you mentioned that you took a nap, right? And so even the idea of rest breeds about notions of, am I being lazy now? Am I not, going as hard as maybe other counterparts, other peers, and as I should? And so how can we align people's mindsets to stop seeing that as a negative, seeing rest and self-care as a negative? Because I think that perpetuates all that we're talking about, which continues to, put us in this vicious cycle.
Mm-hmm. I think actually, a phrase from a song comes to mind. It's a Nicole C. Mullins song. And there's this phrase in one of her songs. It says, speak to your heart like a daughter. And for many of us that to allow self-care to kind of bubble up, it's a journey that we have to take because for so long we've been taught to put other people's needs before our own and not understanding that there's a place to meet other people's needs and to meet your own. And so, I just think that it's like the ability to kind of step, and it's not just the ability, it's developing language, it's developing a mindset around taking care of yourself. And the reason why I've had to do this is because I've worked as a caretaker, taking care of a sick parent, working as a community advocate, as an educator. And what happened is, like, I did that for so long that it began showing up in my life in negative ways, and actually where it was manifesting in my own health, my physical health and my mental health. And so I had to get to this point. It's like, the same way that I love others, I had to start giving myself permission to love myself too. And like I said, that has been a journey because there's been some mindsets that I had to work through. And that's why I said it's not going to happen overnight, but it's something that you can do. And like I said, the first thing is recognizing how it shows up. And so, and so that the guilt, it's deep seated. It usually comes from a very real place. Where you felt like you couldn't stop, or if you took time for yourself, something else would fall apart, and so there's these other things that are connected to that.
Yeah, and I wonder if it could be generational in some regards too. Where we sit determines often what we see, and if we have been conditioned to see people, maybe parents or siblings, caretakers, whatever, that have been always looking out, denying themselves and looking out for others, we may take on that same type of mentality. And then again, the cycle kind of continues. So with that in mind, I want to shift now and I want to talk about how we overcome this. And I know that you speak a lot about resiliency and the importance of that. And so just talk first and foremost about how you define resilience and why that's important to this conversation.
I think that I used to define resilience as like this ability to like bounce back, right? Like you go through something difficult, you have this ability to bounce back from something difficult. Now I define resilience as like just really a dedication to moving to working through things so you can get to that next step, and like this persistence. And so that's how I would really define resilience as this ability to work through, to have a life and the life that you want to live, and so it's a process. I used to think it was an event. It was a special thing, but I believe resilience is something that has to be developed.
Like you truly believe in the power of groups, and I like to refer to them as tribes. And I completely agree. I think there's such value in that. Can you elaborate on the why behind groups as it relates to this broad conversation?
Sure. So one of the things that's important to me about groups is the ability for us to create what I call like groupthink. So individually we have power, but when we collectively unify, we come together, there's a very unique power that you have. So I think my really understanding of the deep connection of groups. And so I'm not a counselor, but at one time I was training to be a counselor. And so I was working at a school outside of Boston in Lawrence. And I had the opportunity to sit in a group counseling session. And what was so powerful is usually in a counseling situation, it's the counselor and someone else, right? You and the counselor. Well, in a group situation, you have the ability not to only receive help, but to give help. So seeing just this exponential way of like connecting with other people. And to me, that was much more reflective of what was going on in the community. And that's why I'm so committed to groups, for people to understand like there's more that we can do together collectively than we could ever do by ourselves. And even in a corporate setting. So when we're looking at a problem,
Yeah, I always say that no one can gets to where they are on their own. So sometimes just that group, it helps us to realize we're not alone. And even just the proximity to people sometimes in the space can be very comforting. So again, it just goes back to you have to find what's going to work for you.
I want to also lift up, because with our conversation with self-care, when it's something that you've committed to developing, something that you're committed to, like you're saying, hey, I recognize the guilt and I want to move past it. Surrounding yourself with people that understand that journey as well, and that will support you in that. And it doesn't mean that it's a big group. It might be 1, 2, or 3 people, but people that will either provide accountability or encouragement to you, to either check in with you. And so that community level also happens on the personal level when you're trying to develop something new, that you're not doing it by yourself. Because what happens, and I'm glad that people are being honest and vulnerable about what they're experiencing, because in your vulnerability, that's how you grow. In your transparency to understand, hey, you're not in this alone. And not only are you not in this alone, you have a community of people that's going to come around and help you.
Yeah, and at its core is providing a sense of belonging. And I always share this audience has heard this probably, way too many times, but it's hard for anyone to show up at their best in any environment if they're always questioning whether or not they belong. So sometimes us feeling not at our best is because we don't feel like we belong. And so I love the idea of groups for that reason. It gives us a sense of belonging. Now I want to shift and I want to talk a little bit about social media. I know that you have some really strong opinions about how social media is certainly adding to all of these emotions that people are going through that could be, again, to the detriment of them showing up at their best. And I want to get a poll started. So Natasha, if you could start a poll, and this is about Social Dilemma. That is the film that Netflix has, and many of you may have seen it, but I just want to get a sense of how many people have seen the film Social Dilemma. But Kayla, if you will, talk to us about, from your vantage point, what role do you feel like social media is playing in terms of the self-care and how people are showing up and how they're beginning to just perceive themselves and life in general?
Mm-hmm. I first want to begin by saying is I believe just like money, social media is a tool, right? And so it could be used for good. It could be used for evil or bad or, whatever you want to call it. So I want to say that social media is a tool. What I feel like what is happening sometimes, and I have my phone right here with me, so I'll kind of like use this, right? Is that why are we picking up our phone, right? Is it because we're lonely? Is it because we want to feel connected? And so we pick up this phone and we're looking to feel like this sense of community, this very human connection. And so what happens for me, sometimes I'll pick it up, I'm lonely, I'm like, okay, I need something to do, right? And I'll go on there, right, hoping to feel connected, but at the end, I feel less connected. And so social media or your phone cannot do for you what a human connection can do for you, whether it's connecting to yourself, connecting to another human being, or a spiritual connection. And so I think that for some people, and it's not just social media, some of us, we have an intimate relationship with our phone. Like we don't even know how the day would go by if we didn't have our phone in our hand. So that's kind of like, that's my strong opinion, is just like, are you more invested in your relationship with your phone than your relationship with people?
So good. I love that. So it looks like we have 74% of the individuals in this community that participated in the poll who have not seen The Social Dilemma, and we have 26 that have. And so for those who, since we have a large percentage of people that have not seen it, perhaps I want to assume that maybe they don't even know what it's about. Can you give us just a high-level overview without giving it away? Because I do think that perhaps because you're hearing it here, you may want to go and check it out. So just give us the premise of what The Social Dilemma film is about.
Yeah, I mean, and I also want to lift up Jared Carroll, who was an earlier a guest on your show. He's the one that posted in LinkedIn about this film. So I said, hey, I'm going to check it out. And so the high level of it is, how does social media how is it impacting our lives? And it gives a very, so you hear from people that have actually created it and their relationship with it and their opinions about it. And so without giving it away, it's just about like, how is social media showing up and what problems has it created? Like why was it created and what problems has it created and who's responsible for the changes?
Yeah, so Sophie, she mentions one of the favorite quotes from the movie is, if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. She states it really captures the message of this documentary. Highly encourage anyone who hasn't seen it yet to watch it. So it's definitely on my list to watch as well. I've heard a lot about it, but because I am big on social media, as an entrepreneur and a business owner, I use it a lot because, as you mentioned, it is a tool. So I think that there's some parts of me that perhaps are like, I kind of know what they're going to say, and I don't want to hear it because I know, and I'm governing myself accordingly to make sure I'm taking the right doses of it. But I'm going to watch it. I'm going to watch it this weekend, and I encourage others who are curious about it to do the same. So I'm going to ask one more question of Kayla, but before I get to that question, I do want to encourage you to use again the stage area for our chatting and for your questions. Those are being curated by my teammates that are coming to me through the backstage, and I will make sure that we allow time to present your questions directly. So
I want to say this because as a business owner, I have the same fear. I'm getting ready to roll out some new products. It's like, how will people know about me? And even before social media existed, there was this thing called word of mouth, but that fear still sits with me. But one of the things that's also made me think of like FOMO, like the fear of missing out. And that's another reason why we're so connected to our phones, because we have the fear. And so for me, I was just like, what is the faith of missing out? What is the fun of missing out? And actually, there are a lot of things. I don't know if people have ever tried to go a day without looking at the news or without looking at their phone. There's this whole other world that exists apart from your phone. And depending on how old you are, there's probably a time in your life where you didn't have a cell phone. And when I think back, I was at least for me, I was much more connected to like taking walks, having conversations with people. I mean, like there are people that are going by us, our neighbors, or just a random stranger that we might have had a conversation with that we don't anymore because we're on our phone. And so it's actually closed off opportunities for us to develop relationships. So I don't know how I'll be navigating it. And that's why I said it's a tool. It's not evil. I don't think social media is evil, but I think thinking about how it's the role it's playing in your life is important to examine.
I agree. I completely agree. Okay, so Mauricio has a question. His question is, how do you address those employees who believe work culture is all about me, myself, and I? Because we do have those people who have no issues with self-care and it's all about them, right? And it's clear. So I think it's a good question. How do you address those employees who believe the work culture is, everything should center around them? It's all about me, myself, and I.
Mm-hmm. I guess I would want to see like how does that show up, like in the way that they're saying it's me, myself, and I. Like, is that a boss? Is that someone? How does that show
Mauricio,
up?
I'm not sure if you want to put some more information into the chat, but it says just employees in general. So I guess it could be just a peer. It also could be maybe someone that's in a position of leadership. But I take the question as people that are really self-centered. And it's which is different from what we're talking about in terms of self-care. And so, Mauricio, if you have some additional thoughts, place it into the chat. But does that help clarify a little bit?
Yes, but you'll find this out about me as I ask a lot of questions. I feel like I didn't have enough information to actually give an informed response to that. So.
Okay, well, Mauricio, if you end up placing something else back into the chat, we'll take a look at it. Let's see what other questions we have here. Okay, so this is from Chris. Thanks for your question, Chris. I'm often seen as the self-care cheerleader on our team, sending and sharing opportunities like this one. But there are some that struggle to prioritize themselves, some that I can literally see and hear crashing into potential burnout. Do you have any advice for trying to reach the harder teammates and creatively getting them to buy into self-care being important and not a bad thing? Bad word. Yeah, that's true. Some people just, let me share this quickly before I let you answer, Kayla, because it just reminds me, I'm seeing this trend where a lot of principals of schools are asking their teachers to leave their laptops with them over the weekend because they're saying, we don't want you to work. And I think in sentiment, it's a gesture to say, I care about you and I want you to be whole. But I also wonder for those people who, like for me, I work a lot. I do. My team will tell you that that's just the nature of I work a lot as an entrepreneur, and so do many other entrepreneurs. But to me, I feel more stressed if someone says to me, I'm taking your computer away so that you can't, be connected. And so I don't know. Anyway, that came to mind as I was reading Chris's question. But do you have thoughts about that for some people who they have a hard time being able to buy into the notion of self-care?
I do. For somebody that has served as a teacher for many years, I do have I have an opinion about that. And one of the things I've seen is like this increase of work. So if you say like, hey, self-care is really important to us and for us to do, it's not simply that you've taken someone's computer away. Maybe you've given them a day off. Maybe you provided them with a coach. Maybe you provided them with some type of thing to support that time. Maybe it's a paid day off. Something like that is an indication to me that you really value my self-care. So simply and that's why I say it's a process. Simply taking somebody's computer away, that creates anxiety for many people because it's just like, well, I wasn't prepared for that. Are you going to give me a day to prepare to take a day off? Because that takes it like when you're preparing to hey, I'm going to be off work for the next 2 weeks. That takes work, And so, but I also want to make sure too that we come back to Chris's question.
Yes, and really that was his question: is what do you do when you have those employees who you're really trying to, encourage some type of self-care because they're burning out, but then they don't see it. I mean, I think that the consequences of not taking self-care is a conversation that is equally important to all the other topics we've brought up, because sometimes people will see it as, no, I'm being the hero. I'm being here for my team. I'm going to keep going hard and hard and hard. But the reality is that it's damaging. It's creating these negative consequences that maybe you aren't realizing. And so that's what comes to mind for me. When people burn out, they're not at their best. Mm-hmm. And so I just wonder if, how do we help this audience to be able to broach that type of conversation in a way to where it can be well received from, maybe their peers or other counterparts within the organizations and environments in which they're working with them.
Yeah, I think the reason I think Chris's message stood out to me is I was like, is Chris's self-care being impacted by trying to get other people to join that bandwagon, right? That self-care bandwagon. So I think something that's really powerful for leaders at their organizations to do, if self-care is really important, then you're also demonstrating to your team what that looks like. You're giving them permission. It's the same with diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. There's a lot of lip service given to it, but if there's not things that are actually in place, if it's not demonstrated across your organization, and so I think it has to actually be something that is showing up in your own life and also in your organization's life.
Yeah, so we have to model it. For those of us who feel as though we've reached a place where we do handle self-care well, for all the fives or even the fours that are close to five, then we need to just maybe keep amplifying that. And hopefully, others will see that you're modeling it and see that it's okay. One word that hasn't come up in our conversation in this hour since we've gone live, but I know we talked about it prior to going live, was control. I think that sometimes we have to put into perspective, what do we have control over and what do we do not have control over? And just the answer to that in and of itself, I think, can help eliminate and at least diminish some of the stress that we feel, which again, stress and anxiety, all of these things is what leads us to have to be so mindful about self-care. So what are just your thoughts on, just again, coming to grips with, there are just some things we have no control over. It is what it is. Mm-hmm. And the importance of that to this conversation.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to share actually a personal story because I saw Jamie put something in the chat about specifically taking it to family caregivers. So years ago, I was actually a caregiver to my mother who was extremely sick. And that was something that I did not have control over. And I would actually go to the hospital every single day to visit her. And so she lived probably about an hour where she was in the hospital. She was about an hour away. So I was going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I would get to a point where when I would visit her, I would just fall asleep because I was so exhausted from doing that. And I realized it was a really hard moment for me. But I realized it's just like, Mom, it's like, I am so sorry, but I will not be able to see you every day, and it was hard for her to hear. And it was hard for me to say, because I wanted to be there for her every day. But what happened when I started going every other day, when I went, I wasn't asleep. And later on, she told me, she's like, our visits are actually better. And so as much as I love my mom and the way that I loved her, I didn't love her any less. But I couldn't even show up for her 100%. She didn't have my full attention because I wasn't okay. And so I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but what I want to say, it's like, it's not one or the other. And when we love people, it's okay to say like, hey, this is how much I can give right now, and this is how much I can't. And actually your relationships get better with the self-care, with putting up those boundaries. But it's so difficult when you're a caretaker and it feels like the world is on your shoulders, but it really isn't. And so going back to this idea of control is looking at the things that you can control, the things that you can't, and seeing and really understanding that. And so that was something that I could control. I didn't realize it at the time. I probably didn't have the language to know that I was like, oh, you're exercising self-care. I just knew I was so exhausted.
No, Kayla, thank you so much for being vulnerable with this community. And I think that example certainly probably has helped a lot of people that are listening to this. We can't control what we can't control. And then it also, to me, it just surfaced the idea of sometimes we think that quantity, frequency is what, dictates the value of whatever our offerings are. but it's more about the quality of it too. And that's in essence what, you and your mom found in those visits. And so I appreciate you sharing that with this community. I really do. So here's another question from our audience. On the topic of community and groups, how can we work to make individuals feel that they belong? I love how thoughtful you are about these questions. I always know something great is going to come out because I can tell.
I think number one is giving people the opportunity to be heard and to be listened to. And again, like I'm very, process is really important to me. And I think this idea of belonging is something that has to be created. Like, you'll see signs all the days. Like, this is one of these phrases, like, you belong, you belong, you belong. And I actually just finished a Brene Brown book about the topic of belonging called Braving the Wilderness, which is an amazing book. I highly recommend it. But in the book, she talks about like belonging to a greater community and belonging to yourself. And so number one, sometimes we're going to be in situations where we feel like we don't belong. And something I said like on social media, right? Or something that I believe in is like this idea of maximizing your margins. And so also having this idea that you belong to yourself and that you have an understanding of like how great and how wonderful you are, and that there's a purpose that is so special for you that only you can fulfill. So I think number one, belonging, you need to belong to you. So no matter what organization you go in, even if you feel like you don't belong, you know within yourself that you have the right things, and I think on a more community level, it's something that has to be developed in unison with other people. So belonging is not something that is just not going to be there. It'll have to be developed where you are working and agreeing and disagreeing, and there's safety. And to me, belonging is what's created when you do the diversity, when you do the equity, when you do the inclusion, when you do the internal work and the external work that it takes to have those things. And that's how people, I feel like they belong.
And that's great. And we have placed the book that you just referenced by Brene Brown into the chat. So I'm sure lots of folks here are going to be taking note of that. So thanks for sharing that resource. So here's a very real question that I'm sure a lot of people are going to find value in your response to. But how can, or is there a correct way in approaching your employer or boss when requesting time away or just time for self-care? Do employees have to prove that you are not doing well and really need it?
Honestly, I think it depends on your work environment. I could say, oh yeah, you should go to your boss and say that you need self-care. But the reality is, like, the work environment that you're in, you might not be safe or might not feel safe to be able to say that. So I don't think that I can blanketly answer that question because I don't know what people's work environment is. And that's why I'm going back to this idea of like, what is available to you, like what do you have control over, and not only what you have control over, but also what are your own individual resources. So if you're at an organization that has like an employee resource, a resource group or employee resources, looking into that might be something that you can do. If you have a boss that you think might be open to that, then that's something that you have to weigh. But not all work environments. Is it safe? Do I think that everybody feels safe to have this conversation with?
Yeah, that's one of the realest answers I've heard in a long time, and you're spot on. So let me kind of shift the question then. What would you say to those who are in this community or may be able to catch the replay later that are people leaders, that are managers, that are they have the ability to influence culture and protocol and decision? What do you say to those leaders right now when you consider that so many people are not equipped or even comfortable and feel safe in asking for what they need for their self-care? What do you say to those leaders?
I say lead by example. whatever it is that you want your employees to be able to do, if you want them to be able to exercise self-care, lead by example, and also be open, be honest, be vulnerable. And I'm specifically talking to people that might want to be developing a program like this. And so that's what I would say to them. And if it's something that you really value, again, it's resourced. It's resourced with people. It's resourced with time. It's resourced with financial things. It's not something that you can merely say, hey, we support self-care here, and now everybody's safe and everybody should have self-care and it's all good to go and let's move on to the next thing. And I think too often that happens. And if you say, this is important for us to do, you have to be able to do the work that you want your employees to do.
That's great. Thank you. So the last question, before then we will close out because we're getting close to the top of the hour, but you've shared a lot of resources already, but are there any others by way of books or podcasts that specifically deal with self-care that you have found to be incredibly helpful that we can share with the community?
Well, let me say this before I offer up any additional books. This is what I want, because resourcefulness, we talked about that, learning that from my mom. What I suggest to the people is that they actually create a list of all the resources that they currently have in their life. So you can go and read, there's plenty, they can Google self-care books. There's plenty of those, right? But they're not going to necessarily tell you what you can do for your life right now. So what I suggest people do is actually create their own resource. So look at okay, this is what I need for self-care. If it's hey, I need water, I need time off, I need time with my family, make a list, right? Then make another list, what is getting in the way of my self-care? And so whatever list that they make, choose one thing that you're going to commit to. So if it's hey, I'm going to start trying to commit to going to the gym, I'm going to commit to using my phone less. So that's actually what I would say in our time that's left, because those books are very helpful. But at the end of the day, you've got to do the work. You've got to incorporate that in your life. I don't hear you.
I do it all the time. Okay, so as we close out, I'm going to add one more poll. And Natasha, I want this poll to be to our audience to answer the question, do you plan to take the challenge and to make that self-care resource list? Simply yes or no. I think we want to hear from you. And while you are getting that question ready and we're casting on our votes and are responding to the poll, I want to just end with this, Kayla. First and foremost, I appreciate you just sharing with this audience today and your time and your wisdom and knowledge. This has been such a timely and meaningful conversation, so we don't take it lightly that you have been a part of today's experience. But really, my last question for you is, what have we not talked about today that you have energy and passion around that you want this audience to know that we have not had a chance to tackle?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm a facilitator. So what I wish we would have gotten to do is just kind of what we did at the end, looking at the resource list. Because I think especially online, there's so much information coming at us, but really looking at practical ways. I'm very pragmatic and practical. I'm how do we take this? So I think just this idea of practically, how does self-care show up in our lives? So strategies around that. So.
That is great. And I'm looking at the poll results and we have 100% yeses, 100% yeses. And so I do hope that we'll each will follow through, and I voted yes as well. I'm going to make my resource list because and I'm a student as well. And what this audience may not realize is that while I'm here kind of facilitating and moderating the discussion with my guest co-hosts, I learn every single week from each of the individuals that are generous enough to give of their time. And so I'm going to make my self-care resource list. And I'm having my team to hold me accountable for it. I'm pretty sure they have some things that they're thinking, yes, this needs to go on the list. But nonetheless, this has been great. Thank you to our live Facebook audience. Thank you to all of you that show up week after week, and even some of you that this may be your first time joining us. Really appreciate it. And we hope you have a great weekend. Do anticipate that this afternoon you will receive an email that's going to have some of the key takeaways as well as a link to the replay from this session. And we hope that you will join us for next week. Again, we're here 11 to 12 noon Eastern Standard Time every Friday. And Kayla, it's been such an honor. Thank you so very much. Really appreciate you.